The wind howled across the rocky coastline as waves crashed against the docks of the small fishing village of Greystone. It was the kind of town that had been forgotten by time, a place where the locals kept to themselves, and the outside world rarely ventured. Fishing boats bobbed lazily in the harbor, their paint chipped and weathered from years of salt and sea. The scent of brine hung thick in the air, mingling with the faint smell of diesel fuel from the boats. At the edge of the harbor, sitting quietly on an overturned crate, was Thomas "Tom" Reed. His weathered hands skillfully tied a knot in his fishing line, his eyes scanning the horizon with the quiet patience of a man who had spent most of his life at sea. His face was etched with deep lines from years of sun, wind, and hard living, and a thick gray beard covered his jaw. His hair, once jet black, was now streaked with silver, and his gaze, sharp, calculating, spoke of a man who had seen more than his fair share of the world's darker side. To the townsfolk, Tom was just a fisherman, a quiet man who kept to himself, spending his days out on the water and his nights at a small, weather-beaten cottage on the edge of town. He was a man of few words, content with his solitude, but there was a presence about him, something in the way he moved, the way he watched the world around him. Some of the older villagers whispered that Tom wasn't always a fisherman, that he had a past he never spoke of, that he wasn't from Greystone originally, that he had arrived one day out of the blue, looking for peace and quiet, a place to disappear. But none of them really knew the truth. What they didn't know, what Tom never told anyone, was that he had once been something very different. Before the quiet life, before the fishing boats and the salty air, Thomas Reed had been a mercenary, a highly skilled operative who had worked in the shadows, taking on the dirtiest jobs in the world's most dangerous places. His hands had seen war, his mind had navigated chaos, and his body bore the scars of countless battles fought in the name of things he no longer believed in. He had walked away from that life years ago, left it all behind. Or so he thought. The peace he had found in Greystone was about to be shattered. The sound of distant engines echoed down the coast road, growing louder with each passing second. The locals, who had been going about their business at the docks, paused and turned their heads toward the sound. The unmistakable rumble of motorcycles reverberated through the village, cutting through the quiet like a knife. The villagers exchanged uneasy glances. They knew what that sound meant. The Iron Serpents, a notorious biker gang that had been causing trouble in the region for months, were rolling into town. Tom didn't look up at the sound of the bikes. He didn't need to. He knew trouble when he heard it. Instead, he continued working on his fishing line, his fingers moving with practiced ease. But his body tensed ever so slightly and his sharp eyes flicked toward the road, tracking the bikers' arrival without appearing to. The gang roared into the village, their motorcycles kicking up dust as they pulled into the small parking lot near the docks. There were 6 of them in total, all clad in leather vests emblazoned with the Iron Serpent's patch, a coiled snake with fangs bared. They dismounted their bikes with the swagger of men who were used to getting what they wanted through intimidation alone. At the front of the pack was their leader, Rocco Viper Moretti, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a shaved head and a thick black beard. His eyes were cold and calculating, and his grin was the kind that never reached his eyes. He scanned the docks, taking in the nervous villagers, the boats, the crates of fish stacked neatly along the pier. The bikers spread out, their boots thudding heavily against the wooden docks as they made their way toward the Fisherman. One of the younger bikers, a wiry man with tattoos snaking up his neck, sneered as he approached one of the locals. "Nice little town you've got here," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Shame if something happened to it." The fisherman, an older man with a weathered face and calloused hands, shifted nervously. "We don't want any trouble," he said. The biker chuckled. "Trouble? We're not here for trouble. We're here for business." Rocco stepped forward, his gaze locking onto the fisherman. "We're expanding our operations. Greystone's a nice, quiet place, perfect for what we've got in mind." "What kind of business?" the fisherman asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Protection," Rocco said smoothly. "We'll make sure nothing bad happens to your boats, or your homes, or your families. All we ask is a small contribution, a little show of appreciation for keeping things peaceful." The fisherman swallowed hard. "We don't have much." Rocco's grin widened. "You'll find a way." As the gang continued their intimidation, Tom remained seated on his crate, his fishing line now neatly tied. He watched the scene unfold with a detached calm, his mind already working through the situation. He recognized men like these. He had dealt with them before, in far more dangerous places than Greystone, and he knew exactly how to handle them. The bikers hadn't noticed him yet, but that was about to change. One of the gang members, a burly man with a scar running down his cheek, spotted Tom sitting by himself. He nudged the biker next to him. "Hey, check out the old guy." The two men sauntered over, their leather boots thudding heavily on the dock. The burly man leaned down, a smirk on his face. "Hey, old man, you hard of hearing? Didn't you hear the boss? We're here for business." Tom looked up slowly, his gaze locking onto the bikers. There was no fear in his eyes, just calm, steady resolve. "I heard," Tom said quietly. The burly man chuckled. "Good. Then you know what's expected. Let's start with you. What do you say?" Tom stood slowly, his movements deliberate. He picked up his fishing rod and slung it over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. "I'm just a fisherman," he said. "Got nothing to offer." The biker's smirk faded. He didn't like the calm confidence in Tom's voice. It unsettled him. "Everybody's got something to offer," he said, stepping closer. "And you're gonna offer it, one way or another." Tom's gaze flicked to the leader of the gang, Rocco, who was still talking to the other fishermen. Then he looked back at the burly biker in front of him. "I suggest you walk away," Tom said quietly. The biker's eyes narrowed. "You suggesting something? You got a problem, old man?" Tom's lips twitched into a faint smile. "Not yet." The biker growled, reaching out to grab Tom by the collar, but before his hand could make contact, Tom moved. His fishing rod swung with surprising speed, the wooden pole cracking against the biker's wrist. The man yelped in pain, stumbling back and clutching his arm. "What the hell?" the biker snarled. Tom stepped forward, his calm demeanor unwavering. "I told you to walk away." The commotion drew the attention of Rocco and the other bikers. Rocco's eyes narrowed as he took in the scene. He strode over, his boots thudding heavily against the dock. "What's going on here?" Rocco demanded. The burly biker glared at Tom. "This old bastard thinks he's tough." Rocco's gaze locked onto Tom. "Is that so?" Tom met his gaze without flinching. "I'm not looking for trouble, but I won't stand by while you threaten this town." Rocco studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he chuckled. "You've got guts, old man. I'll give you that. But guts won't save you." Tom's gaze hardened. "I've been saving myself for a long time." Rocco's smile faded. "Who are you?" Tom didn't answer. He didn't need to, because the answer was already written in his eyes. Rocco stood in front of Tom, sizing him up with narrowed eyes. The rest of the iron serpents gathered around, their boots crunching against the gravel-covered dock. The tension hung thick in the air, broken only by the sound of waves crashing against the shore. "You've got a big mouth for an old man," Rocco said, his voice low and dangerous. He took a slow step closer, his hands resting on his belt buckle. "What makes you think you can stand up to us? This town's got no cops, no backup, just you and a bunch of scared fishermen." Tom didn't flinch. His eyes stayed locked on Rocco's, unblinking, calm, and calculating. "I've seen men like you before," Tom said. "Men who think they can take what they want because they've never been stopped. But let me tell you something." He leaned in just slightly, his voice dropping to a quiet, steady tone. "Everyone gets stopped, sooner or later." The bikers exchanged glances, their sneers faltering for a moment, before one of them, the wiry man with tattoos running up his neck, stepped forward. His nickname was Viper, and he was known for his quick temper and even quicker fists. "Are you threatening us, old man?" Viper hissed, taking another step toward Tom. Tom shook his head slowly. "Not a threat, just a fact." Viper's eyes burned with anger, and he pulled a knife from his pocket, flipping it open with a sharp click. The blade glinted in the dim light of the street lamp above, and a murmur of anticipation rippled through the gang. The other fishermen on the dock stood frozen, their faces pale with fear. They had never seen anyone stand up to the iron serpents before, and they certainly hadn't expected a quiet, unassuming fisherman to do so. But something about Tom's demeanor, the way he held himself, the way he spoke, gave them a glimmer of hope. Viper took a step closer, holding the knife low and ready. "You've got one chance to back off," he growled. "Walk away now. and maybe we won't make you bleed." Tom didn't move. His hands rested calmly by his sides, his fishing rod still slung over his shoulder. But his eyes never left Viper's, and there was something in his gaze that made the younger man hesitate. "You ever been on the wrong side of a fight, son?" Tom asked quietly. "Ever stood toe-to-toe with someone who's got nothing to lose?" Viper faltered for a moment, his grip on the knife tightening, but his pride wouldn't let him back down in front of his crew. He lunged forward, the knife aimed straight at Tom's chest. It happened in a blur. Tom stepped to the side with practiced ease, grabbing Viper's wrist and twisting it sharply. The knife clattered to the ground, and before Viper could react, Tom brought his elbow down hard on the back of the man's head, sending him sprawling to the dock. The bikers froze, their eyes wide with shock. Rocco's expression darkened, and he took a step forward, his fists clenched at his sides. "You've got some moves," he said, "but you're not going to take us all on." Tom straightened, adjusting his jacket. His expression was calm, but there was a dangerous edge to his voice. "I don't need to." Just then, the sound of footsteps echoed from the shadows. More figures emerged from the alleyways and side streets, fishermen, townspeople, and a few familiar faces from Tom's past. Men who had quietly followed Tom's lead, waiting for the right moment to show their support. Among them was Frank Doyle, an old friend and former mercenary who had retired to Greystone years ago. He was built like a tank, with a thick beard and a no-nonsense attitude. Frank stepped up beside Tom, giving him a nod. "Thought you might need a hand," Frank said, his voice gruff. Tom gave a faint smile. "Appreciate it." The bikers shifted uneasily as more townspeople gathered, many of them carrying tools, wrenches, shovels, fishing gaffs. They weren't soldiers, but they were ready to defend their town. Rocco's eyes darted around, taking in the growing crowd. His bravado wavered for the first time. "You think this changes anything?" he sneered. "You think a bunch of fishermen and old men are going to scare us off?" Frank stepped forward, towering over Rocco. "We're not here to scare you," he said. "We're here to end this." Rocco clenched his jaw, his fists tightening. He wasn't used to being challenged, and the realization that he was losing control of the situation hit him hard. But his pride wouldn't let him back down. "All right," Rocco growled. "Let's see what you've got." He gave a sharp whistle, and the remaining bikers drew their weapons, knives, chains, crowbars. The tension in the air was palpable, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, all hell broke loose. The bikers charged forward, their boots pounding against the wooden dock. But the townspeople didn't retreat. They stood their ground, meeting the gang head-on with a fierce determination. Frank swung a heavy wrench, knocking a biker off his feet. Another fisherman used a fishing gaff to disarm one of the attackers, sending the man's crowbar clattering to the ground. The sound of fists connecting with flesh, the clatter of metal on wood, and the shouts of the combatants filled the night air. Tom moved through the chaos with calm precision, his years of training kicking in. He disarmed another biker with a swift strike of his fishing rod, then used his cane to trip a third. Rocco fought with wild aggression, swinging his fists and bellowing orders to his crew, but it was clear that the Iron Serpents were outmatched. They had relied on fear and intimidation for too long, and now they were facing people who had had enough. As the fight raged on, Tom found himself face to face with Rocco once more. "You think you've won?" Rocco snarled, his chest heaving. "You think this is over?" Tom's expression didn't change. "It's over when you leave." Rocco lunged at Tom, but Tom sidestepped the attack, using his cane to knock the biker off balance. Rocco stumbled, falling to his knees on the dock. Tom stood over him, his gaze cold and unyielding. "You've made your point. Now get out of our town." Rocco glared up at him, his pride wounded, but he knew he was beaten. Slowly he climbed to his feet, wiping blood from the corner of his mouth. "You'll regret this," Rocco growled. "We'll be back." Tom shook his head. "No, you won't." The remaining bikers helped their fallen comrades to their feet, their confidence shattered. One by one, they climbed onto their motorcycles, the roar of their engines cutting through the night as they sped out of town. As the sound of the motorcycles faded into the distance, the townspeople began to gather around Tom, their expressions a mix of relief and gratitude. Frank clapped Tom on the back. "Looks like you've still got it." Tom chuckled softly. "Some things you don't forget." One of the fishermen stepped forward, his voice trembling with emotion. "Thank you, all of you." Tom nodded. "This is our home. We protect what's ours." The townspeople dispersed, returning to their homes with a renewed sense of pride and unity. The night was quiet once more, the tension in the air replaced by a calm peace. Tom stood on the dock, watching the waves crash against the shore. Frank joined him, lighting a cigarette. "You really think they won't come back?" Frank asked. Tom's gaze remained on the horizon. "If they do, we'll be ready." The dawn broke quietly over the small fishing village of Greystone. The sky, painted in soft hues of orange and pink, stretched over the harbor where the waters now lay still. The night's tension had melted away, replaced by an eerie calm. Boats bobbed gently in the tide, and the docks that had been a battleground hours ago were once again deserted, save for a few scattered tools and splinters of broken wood. Tom Reed stood at the edge of the pier, watching the horizon. His hands rested lightly on his cane, the salt wind brushing through his graying hair. Behind him, the village was slowly waking up, people cautiously emerging from their homes, glancing around as if to confirm that the nightmare was over. Frank Doyle approached quietly, his heavy boots thudding against the wooden planks of the dock. He stopped beside Tom, lighting a cigarette with a practiced flick of his lighter. "Looks like they're gone," Frank said, exhaling a cloud of smoke. Tom nodded slowly. "For now." Frank tilted his head, studying his old friend. "You think they'll be back?" Tom's gaze remained fixed on the horizon. "No, they've lost their grip. They relied on fear to control people, and now that's gone. They know they're not welcome here anymore." Frank grunted in agreement. "Well, if they do come back, they'll get the same welcome they got last night." A faint smile tugged at the corner of Tom's mouth. "I'm sure they will." The two men stood in silence for a moment, the only sound the gentle lapping of the waves against the dock. The village felt different now, stronger, more unified. The people of Greystone had seen what it meant to stand up for themselves, to take back their power from those who sought to take it away. One by one, the townspeople began to gather at the docks. They approached cautiously, their faces a mix of relief and gratitude. Fishermen, shopkeepers, and families. All of them had been affected by the Iron Serpent's reign of terror, and now they looked to Tom and the other veterans with newfound respect. A young boy ran up to Tom, wide-eyed and curious. "Mr. Reed, are you really a soldier?" Tom glanced down at the boy, his expression softening. He knelt slowly, resting his cane on the ground beside him. "I was," he said quietly, "a long time ago." The boy's eyes sparkled with awe. "Were you in the war?" Tom nodded. "I was." The boy's father hurried over, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "I'm sorry, Mr. Reed. He's just curious." Tom waved it off. "It's all right." He looked at the boy again, his voice gentle. "War isn't something to be admired, son. It's something to be survived." The boy nodded solemnly, absorbing the weight of Tom's words. "But you're a hero, right?" Tom's expression grew thoughtful. "A hero is someone who does what needs to be done, even when it's hard, even when it's scary." He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Remember that." The boy smiled shyly before his father led him away. As they walked back toward the village, the father turned and gave Tom a respectful nod, a silent acknowledgement of what he had done for them all. Frank chuckled softly. "Looks like you've got yourself a fan club." Tom stood slowly, leaning on his cane. "Not what I was aiming for." Frank smirked. "No, but it's what you got." Sarah appeared next, her face a mix of relief and lingering worry. She walked up to Tom, wrapping her arms around him in a tight hug. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Tom patted her back gently. "I told you I'd protect this town." Sarah pulled back, her eyes glistening with tears. I can't believe it's over." Tom's gaze hardened slightly. "It's never really over. There's always someone out there looking to take advantage of people. But as long as we stand together, they won't win." Sarah nodded, wiping her eyes. "You're right." The crowd at the docks began to disperse, people heading back to their homes, their businesses, their lives. But the sense of fear that had once hung over Greystone was gone, replaced by quiet strength. As the village returned to normal, Frank clapped Tom on the shoulder. "What now?" Tom took a deep breath, the sea air filling his lungs. "I go back to fishing." Frank raised an eyebrow. "Just like that?" "Just like that," Tom said with a faint smile. "Life goes on." Frank chuckled. "You make it sound so easy." "It's not," Tom admitted. "But it's what we do." Frank nodded, tossing his cigarette into the water. "Well, if you ever need a hand out on the water, you know where to find me." Tom smiled. "I'll hold you to that." As Frank walked away, Tom remained at the edge of the dock, watching the horizon once more. The waves crashed gently against the shore, the tide rising and falling in an endless rhythm. Life in Greystone would continue, just as it always had. But something had changed. The village had found its strength, and Tom had found a piece of himself that he thought he'd left behind. The sun climbed higher in the sky, casting its golden light over the harbor. Tom stood quietly, his cane resting by his side, his mind calm for the first time in a long while. The iron serpents were gone. Peace had returned to Greystone, and as long as Tom Reed stood watch, it would stay that way.